"I didn't do anything," she cried, her breath shaking, heart pounding in pure fear. They were seconds away from ending her life, until the king arrived. One look into her eyes, and everything changed. Because the most dangerous man in the empire saw something no one else did. She wasn't the traitor, she was the truth they were trying to bury. The night was soaked in rain, the kind that blurred vision and drowned sound, turning the abandoned dockyard into a cold, unforgiving maze of shadows. The air itself carried fear, thick and suffocating, wrapping around everything like a warning no one could escape. Rusted containers stood like silent witnesses to the chaos unfolding, while distant waves crashed against the docks with a hollow echo that felt like a whisper of something darker beneath the surface. Arya Bennett's body scraped against the wet concrete as she was dragged forward, her breath uneven, her chest tightening with every movement, her heart pounding so violently it felt like it might shatter her ribs from the inside. Her fingers clawed at the ground instinctively, searching for anything to hold on to. But there was nothing. No safe place, no escape, no control. Only danger. Her voice broke into the night, fragile and desperate, barely rising above the storm. She kept insisting she had done nothing, that she did not understand why this was happening. But her words dissolved into the rain before they could reach anyone who mattered. The men surrounding her did not listen. Their faces were hard, emotionless, bound by loyalty to something far more powerful than truth. They spoke of betrayal. They spoke of treason against the Empire. And in their world, betrayal was not a mistake. It was a death sentence. The tension thickened as one of the men stepped forward, his posture signaling finality. The execution order was seconds away from being carried out. Everything about the moment screamed inevitability, as if her fate had already been written long before she ever stepped into this nightmare. Arya's body trembled, her breath catching sharply as fear gripped her tighter than the hands holding her down. She was not a fighter, not someone built for war. Yet here she was, at the center of one she didn't even understand. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. The low growl of an engine cut through the storm. A black car appeared at the far end of the dockyard, its presence commanding attention in a way nothing else could. The headlights sliced through the rain, and with them came a shift so absolute that even the wind seemed to hesitate. The men froze, their movements halting mid-action, their focus snapping toward the vehicle with an instinctive understanding of what it meant. Power had arrived. Control had returned. The door opened slowly, deliberately, and Lucien Veyron stepped out. He did not rush. He did not need to. His very existence bent the moment around him. The king of the empire moved forward with calm precision, every step measured, every motion carrying a weight that pressed down on everyone present. The storm did not touch him the same way. It felt as though even the rain respected the invisible boundary of his authority. Silence followed him like a shadow. A whisper of death lingered in the air as he approached. Arya's head lifted weakly, her vision blurred, her breath shallow and uneven. And then she saw him. Not just a man, not just a leader, but something far more dangerous. Someone who did not need to prove his power because it radiated from him effortlessly. Fear surged through her again, but beneath it, something else flickered. Something fragile. Something desperate. Truth. Lucien stopped just a few steps away, his presence overwhelming in its stillness. He did not look at the men first. He did not ask questions. His gaze went directly to her. Close. Too close. Close enough to hear her breath. Close enough to feel the frantic rhythm of her heart pounding against the silence between them. He watched her carefully, not searching for words, but for something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. The storm faded into the background as the world narrowed to a single moment. His eyes locked onto hers, reading everything she could not say. And then something shifted. A realization. Cold. Precise. Absolute. She was not a victim of circumstance. She was being sacrificed. The air changed instantly. Lucien's expression remained controlled, but his decision was already made. Without raising his voice, without needing to explain, he lifted a single hand, and everything stopped. The execution ended before it began. Confusion rippled through his men, their loyalty clashing with the unexpected command. Betrayal had not been erased. The accusation still hung heavy in the air, but the outcome had changed in a way none of them could challenge. Lucian stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Arya. The shift in power was undeniable. The girl who had been seconds away from death was now standing at the center of his control. Protected, claimed, his. And yet, the question lingered in the silence, sharper than any weapon. Why would a ruthless king risk his entire empire for a girl accused of betrayal? Long before the rain-soaked night at the dockyard, Arya Bennett had already been living in a quiet war of survival, one that never made noise, but never truly ended. Her world had always been built in shadows, where staying unnoticed was not just a habit but a necessity. She was the kind of girl people overlooked without effort, blending into the background of crowded offices and dim streets. Her presence, soft enough to be forgotten, but sharp enough to observe everything around her. Her life revolved around a single purpose: to survive and to protect the only person who mattered, her younger sister. Every decision Arya made, every risk she avoided, every silent compromise she accepted was tied to that fragile responsibility. Their apartment was small, barely holding together under the weight of unpaid bills and quiet desperation, but to her, it was the closest thing to safe she had ever known. Even that safety, however, always felt temporary, like something the world could take away at any moment. Danger was never far. It lingered in unpaid notices, in late-night footsteps outside their door, in the subtle tension that followed her everywhere. Arya understood early that survival meant control. Control over her emotions, her movements, her visibility. She learned how to keep her head down, how to speak less, how to become invisible even in plain sight. That was how she ended up working as a data clerk in a logistics company that looked ordinary from the outside, but carried a different kind of power beneath its surface. The building itself was quiet, efficient, structured. Everything about it suggested order. But Arya noticed things others ignored: patterns, numbers that didn't align, shipments that appeared and disappeared without explanation, codes buried inside routine entries. Her mind, always sharp and observant, began connecting details unconsciously. She did not seek trouble, did not chase secrets, but they found her anyway. The deeper she looked, the more the illusion of normalcy began to crack, revealing something much larger hiding underneath. Something connected to an empire she didn't even know existed at the time. She never spoke about it, not because she didn't understand, but because she understood too well. In her world, knowledge was not power, it was risk. And risk meant danger. But the world had already decided her role. Before she could step back, before she could erase herself from the edges of something she was never meant to see, everything turned against her. Files she had never touched were suddenly traced back to her. Access logs were manipulated. Her name appeared in places it should not have been. The quiet life she had built with such careful control began collapsing under accusations she couldn't fight. Betrayal wrapped around her existence like a tightening grip. Trust disappeared instantly. The same environment that once ignored her now turned its full attention toward her. Eyes followed her movements. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. The silence around her was no longer protective. It was suffocating. She was branded a traitor. The shift was immediate and irreversible. The empire she had unknowingly brushed against did not tolerate uncertainty. And in its eyes, she had already crossed a line. Whether she had done anything or not no longer mattered. What mattered was control, and control required an answer. She became that answer. The chase began without warning. Arya ran, not because she believed she could escape, but because instinct demanded it. Her breath grew uneven as the world closed in around her, every step echoing with fear, every shadow holding the possibility of capture. Her heart pounding in a rhythm that matched the urgency of her thoughts. She realized something that shattered whatever illusion she had left. She was not a victim of coincidence. She was being pushed, forced into a narrative she did not choose. The truth settled deep within her, cold and undeniable. She was not a victim, but the world kept pushing her into danger, shaping her into something she never intended to become. And then it ended, not with resistance, not with escape, but with inevitability. She was found, captured without chaos, without noise, without the kind of struggle that would make a difference. The people who came for her moved with precision, their loyalty unquestionable, their purpose clear. There was no anger in them, No hesitation. Only execution of orders. She was taken without explanation. No chance to defend herself. No moment to be heard. The world she had tried so hard to stay invisible and had finally turned its full attention toward her, and it had already decided her fate. By the time she was dragged into the storm, into the cold emptiness of the dockyard, her strength had already been drained by the weight of everything she didn't understand. The rain blurred her vision, but it could not hide the reality closing in around her. The Empire had judged her, and now it was ready to erase her. Yet one question remained, sharper than fear, deeper than betrayal, echoing through every broken breath she took. If she was truly innocent, then who needed her silenced so badly? Lucien Veyron was not just a man who ruled an empire. He was the force that defined it. In a world built on shifting alliances and silent wars, his name carried a weight that did not need to be spoken loudly to be understood. It existed in whispers, in cautious glances, in the quiet fear that followed every decision made in the underworld. He did not chase power. He embodied it. Control was not something he fought for. It was something he maintained with absolute precision. Every movement within his empire, every rise and fall of influence, every silent agreement or unseen conflict traced back to him. His decisions were not merely choices. They dictated the balance between war and fragile peace. Men who claimed loyalty to him did, so not out of blind devotion, but out of a deep understanding that betrayal was not just punished, it was erased completely. In Lucien's world, there were no second chances, no room for uncertainty. Loyalty was currency, and betrayal was the one mistake that ended everything. He did not need to raise his voice to be obeyed. He did not need to prove his authority. His presence alone was enough. That presence now stood at the center of the storm, calm and unshaken, while the rain continued to fall as if it belonged to a different world entirely. The men surrounding Arya had seen fear before, had enforced it countless times. But the moment Lucien arrived, that fear shifted. It no longer belonged to the girl at their feet. It belonged to him. Because Lucien Veyron did not react. He observed. There was a reason for that. A reason carved deep into the foundation of who he had become. Years ago, before his empire reached its full height, before his control became absolute, there had been a fracture, a betrayal so precise and personal that it did not just threaten his power. It reshaped it. Someone he had trusted, someone who had stood close enough to understand his every move, had turned against him in a way that nearly destroyed everything he had built. He survived, but survival came with a cost. From that moment forward, Lucien no longer relied on words, on promises, or on appearances. He learned to read what others could not hide. The subtle shifts in breath, the flicker behind the eyes, the silent signals of truth and deception that existed beyond language. It was not instinct. It was control sharpened into something unbreakable. That was why Arya Bennett unsettled the moment. Because when he looked at her, he did not see what the others saw. He did not see betrayal. He saw something that did not belong in that narrative. Her breath was uneven, her heart pounding in a rhythm of pure fear. But beneath that fear, there was no calculation, no hidden agenda, no trace of deception. Only raw, unfiltered truth. A truth that did not align with the accusation placed on her. And Lucien understood immediately. She was not lying. She was not playing a role. She was not the traitor they believed her to be. Without hesitation, without explanation, he made his decision. A single motion of his hand was enough to shift the entire outcome. The execution that had been seconds away from completion dissolved into nothing, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than any command. Arya was to be kept alive. The order did not need to be repeated. It was enough. Shock moved through his inner circle, subtle but undeniable. The accusation of betrayal had not disappeared. The threat to the Empire still existed. Yet Lucien had chosen to intervene. That alone was enough to disrupt the balance of control they had always relied on. Questions formed, but none of them dared to speak. Because questioning him meant crossing a line no one survived. Lucien stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the girl who had unknowingly altered the course of his attention. The space between them felt charged, heavy with something neither of them fully understood yet. His gaze remained fixed on her, unyielding, as if confirming his decision once more. Then, without words, without hesitation, the shift became final. She was under his direct protection. The meaning was clear. She was no longer just a suspect. She belonged within his control now. The power dynamic changed instantly. The same men who had dragged her across the ground moments ago now stepped back, their loyalty forcing them to accept what they could not understand. The Empire itself adjusted to his decision, because that was what it always did. Lucian did not explain himself. He did not need to. His authority was absolute. And in that moment, Arya Bennett, once invisible, once powerless, stood at the center of something far greater than herself. Not free, not safe, but undeniably his. Yet even as the storm continued to fall and the silence settled around them, one question lingered beneath everything, sharper than doubt, deeper than control. What did Lucian Veyron see in her eyes that no one else could? The transition from the chaos of the dockyard to Lucian Veyron's world was not loud or dramatic, but it was absolute. Arya Bennett did not remember the exact moment the storm faded behind her, only the suffocating awareness that she had crossed a line she could never return from. The car that carried her moved in silence, its interior dim and controlled, isolating her from everything she had known. Her breath had not fully steadied since the dockyard, her heart pounding slower now, but heavier, as if it understood the gravity of where she was being taken. When the gates opened, the first thing she felt was not relief. It was a different kind of fear. The mansion stood like a fortress, its structure imposing, its presence dominating everything around it. It was not just a home. It was the center of an empire, a place where power and control were not just concepts, but the foundation of every decision made within its walls. The guards moved with precision, their loyalty unquestionable, their eyes sharp with awareness. Nothing here was accidental. Nothing was left to chance. Arya stepped inside, and the shift was immediate. Outside had been chaos, unpredictable and wild. Inside was controlled, calculated, suffocating in its perfection. The danger had not disappeared. It had simply changed form. It no longer chased her through shadows. It surrounded her in silence. And yet, beneath that overwhelming presence, something else existed. A strange, unfamiliar sense of safe. Not freedom, never freedom, but survival, contained within someone else's control. She was alive because of him. That truth settled deeply, shaping every thought that followed. Lucian did not rush the process. He did not interrogate her in the way she expected, with pressure or force or visible accusation. Instead, he watched. Every movement she made, every shift in her expression, every uneven breath she tried to steady under the weight of his presence. He noticed it all. His method was not about questions. It was about patterns. Arya felt it constantly, that invisible pressure of being observed. When she walked through the halls, when she sat in silence, when she tried to make sense of the world she had been pulled into. He was there, not always physically close, but always present. His attention did not waver, and it did not need to, because Lucian Veyron did not miss anything. He tested her without making it obvious. Small situations, subtle changes in routine, controlled interactions with the people around her. He watched how she reacted to tension, to uncertainty, to the quiet mentions of betrayal within the Empire. Every reaction she gave was unfiltered, untrained, real. And that was what confirmed it. She knew nothing. No hidden agenda. No deception. No connection to the betrayal that had nearly cost her life. The realization did not weaken his focus. It sharpened it. If Arya was not the traitor, then the truth was far more dangerous than he had anticipated. It meant the betrayal was real, but it was not external. It was not a threat from outside the Empire. It was inside. Someone close enough to understand the system. Someone trusted enough to manipulate it. Arya had not been the enemy. She had been the distraction. A scapegoat placed carefully to redirect attention, to maintain control, to hide something far deeper beneath the surface. And the fact that it had reached the point of execution meant the betrayal was not just intelligent, it was bold. Lucian's focus shifted, not away from Arya, but deeper into what she represented. She was no longer just someone he had spared. She was a key, not because of what she had done, but because of what she had unknowingly seen. The patterns she noticed, the details she remembered, the quiet intelligence she carried without realizing its value. These were not accidents. They were pieces of something much larger. And Lucian did not ignore pieces. He used them. His decision became clear. She would stay, not as a guest, not as a prisoner in the traditional sense, but as something in between, bound to him by circumstance, by necessity, by the undeniable fact that her existence was now tied to his empire. The forced bond took shape in silence, in proximity, in the constant awareness that neither of them could step away from what had begun. Arya resisted it at first, emotionally, instinctively. She tried to hold onto the idea that she did not belong there, that she was still separate from his world. But resistance weakened over time, worn down by the consistency of his control. Because for all the danger that surrounded him, Lucian also provided something she had never experienced before. Protection. Not soft, not gentle, but absolute. No one touched her without his approval. No one questioned her presence openly. The message was clear to everyone within those walls. She was under his control. She was his to protect. And that changed everything. The tension between them grew with every passing moment, unspoken but undeniable. He remained distant, calculated, focused on the truth he intended to uncover. She remained uncertain, caught between fear and the unfamiliar sense of safety his presence created. It was not trust. Not yet, but it was something that could become it. And as the pieces slowly began to align, as the truth moved closer to the surface, one realization stood above all others, heavy and unavoidable. If the betrayal was inside the Empire, then who was powerful enough to deceive the king himself? Time inside Lucian Veyron's mansion did not move the way Arya Bennett understood time before. It did not rush, did not drag. It settled into a controlled rhythm, steady and deliberate, shaped entirely by the will of the king who ruled within those walls. The chaos that once defined her life had faded into something quieter, something more dangerous in its stillness. The fear that had once consumed every breath she took did not disappear, but it changed, softening at the edges whenever Lucian was near, as if his presence alone created a boundary the rest of the world could not cross. Arya began to adapt, not because she wanted to, but because survival demanded it. The mansion no longer felt like an unknown threat at every turn. Its structure, its silence, its carefully controlled environment began to make sense. Every movement within it had purpose. Every decision carried weight. It was an empire contained within walls, and she was now a part of it, whether she accepted it or not. She started to observe him. At first, it was instinct, watching the source of the power that had changed her fate. But slowly, observation turned into understanding. Lucian Veyron was not unpredictable, not chaotic. His control was absolute, but it was not reckless. There was calculation behind everything he did, a precision that did not allow for unnecessary cruelty. He was not kind, not soft, but he was not what she had expected either. He watched her in return, not openly, not in a way that could be easily confronted, but constantly. Her movements, her choices, the way she processed the world around her, it all held his attention. There was something in her resilience that did not align with the role she had been forced into. She did not break the way most would have. She adapted, quietly, carefully, and that intrigued him more than he allowed himself to acknowledge. It began with small things, documents placed within her reach, subtle tasks that seemed insignificant but carried hidden purpose, numbers that required organizing, patterns that needed recognition, systems that demanded clarity. At first, Arya hesitated, unsure whether it was a test or a trap, but her mind responded instinctively, the same way it always had. She saw what others missed. Connections formed where there should have been none. Irregularities surfaced beneath structured data. Her thoughts aligned with logic that felt natural to her, even in a place that was anything but. And slowly, without announcement, without recognition, her role began to shift. She was no longer just the girl who had been dragged into the Empire. She was becoming something else. She was not a victim, she became powerful. The realization did not come all at once. It built quietly, piece by piece. Every time she understood something before it was explained. Every time Lucian adjusted his approach based on her observations. Every time she felt her own control returning in small, undeniable ways. And with that shift came something unexpected. Protection. It was never spoken, never explained, but it was constant. Subtle changes in how others interacted with her. The way tension dissolved before it could escalate. The way unspoken threats disappeared before reaching her. Lucian did not announce his actions, but his influence was absolute. No one crossed the line he had drawn. No one challenged what he had claimed. The message spread without words. She was under his protection. She was his to protect. And that changed how the Empire saw her. It also changed how she saw him. The tension between them deepened, no longer built on fear alone, but something more complicated, something that existed in the silence between them, in the moments where distance felt smaller than it should have been. When he stood close, the air shifted. Her breath slowed, not from fear, but from awareness. Her heart pounding not from danger, but from something she did not fully understand. Lucian noticed it, not just in her, but in himself. The instinct was unfamiliar, but undeniable. The need to maintain control remained, but it was layered now with something sharper, something more possessive. His focus on her was no longer purely strategic. It had become instinctual. Mine. The thought was not spoken, but it existed, shaping his decisions in ways he did not question. And Arya felt it, not as a claim, not as ownership, but as a shift in how the world around her responded. She was still not free. She still existed within his control. But the fear that once defined her existence was no longer the only thing she felt. There was something else now. Something dangerous in its own way. Safety. The contradiction unsettled her. Because safe did not belong in a world built on betrayal. It did not belong beside a man who ruled through power and control. And yet it existed, undeniable and growing stronger with every passing moment. Loyalty began to take shape. Not forced, not demanded, but formed through understanding, through shared silence, through the unspoken recognition that neither of them could ignore what was building between them. And that was the most dangerous part of all. Because in a world where betrayal defined survival, attachment was a risk no one could afford. What happens when protection turns into something deeper, something impossible to control, in a world built entirely on betrayal? The shift did not happen in a single moment. It unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, the same way Arya Bennett had always existed in the world, unnoticed until it was too late to ignore her. What had once been small observations, minor corrections, subtle insights began to form something much larger, something impossible to dismiss. The empire Lucian Veyron controlled was built on precision, on systems that had been refined over years of power and control, yet Arya was beginning to see through them in ways no one else could. It started with numbers. Not just figures on a screen or transactions recorded in silence, but patterns hidden beneath them, movements that did not align, routes that shifted without reason, financial trails that bent slightly where they should have remained straight. To anyone else, they were insignificant. To Arya, they were impossible to ignore. Her mind did not just process data, it understood it. She could trace the flow of money the same way someone followed a map, recognizing where it should go and where it had been deliberately redirected. Every irregularity carried meaning. Every inconsistency pointed toward intention. And the deeper she looked, the clearer it became. Someone inside the empire was manipulating its foundation, not carelessly, not randomly, but with intelligence that matched the structure itself. When she brought her findings forward, not with confidence, but with quiet certainty, Lucian did not interrupt. He watched her, the same way he always had. But this time there was something different in his attention, something sharper, something that acknowledged what she was becoming. She was no longer just a variable in his investigation. She was the key to it. The realization settled between them without words. Lucian did not need confirmation beyond what he already understood. The pattern she uncovered, the clarity in her reasoning, the absence of hesitation in her conclusions, it all aligned with something he had rarely seen. Precision. Arya Bennett was not simply observant. She was dangerous in ways no one had anticipated. The power dynamic shifted in that moment, subtle but undeniable. She was no longer weak, no longer defined by the fear that had once controlled her every breath. She stood differently now, not physically, but in presence. There was awareness in her movements, control in her thoughts, a growing understanding of the space she occupied within the empire. She was not a victim, she became powerful. Lucian recognized it before she fully did. And once he saw it, he adjusted. She was brought closer, not as a possession, not as something fragile to be protected from a distance, but as someone who needed to stand near the center of what was unfolding. The work between them became more direct, more focused. Long hours spent analyzing data, tracing patterns, building connections that reached deeper into the structure of the empire than anyone had dared to look before. The proximity changed everything. The silence between them was no longer empty. It carried weight, intention, something unspoken but understood. When they stood close, the air seemed to narrow, her breath steady but aware, his presence constant and unyielding. There was no need for unnecessary words. Their focus aligned naturally. Each step forward built on a shared understanding of what needed to be uncovered. Trust began to form. Not easily, not completely, but enough. Enough for Lucian to rely on her insight. Enough for Arya to feel that her place was no longer uncertain. Loyalty followed, not demanded but earned, shaped by the reality that they were now working toward the same truth. She was no longer just surviving within his world. She was becoming part of it, and that was when the tension began to rise. Not between them, but around them. The Empire was not blind. Shifts in power did not go unnoticed, especially when they involved someone who had once been marked for betrayal. Eyes lingered longer than before. Conversations lowered when she entered a room. The silence that followed her was no longer indifference. It was suspicion. She felt it, the whisper of doubt moving through the walls. Questions forming where there had once been none. Lucian's protection remained absolute, but even that did not erase the reality of what was happening. The deeper they moved into the truth, the more unstable the foundation around them became. Because uncovering betrayal was not just about finding an enemy. It was about exposing someone who had already earned trust, someone who had already proven loyalty, someone who stood close enough to the king to never be questioned. Arya's role became clearer with every step forward. She was no longer hidden, no longer insignificant. She was standing at the edge of something that could either secure the Empire's future or destroy it entirely. And as the final pieces began to align, as the pattern she followed led closer to a single point, one realization settled in with a weight that could not be ignored. What if the betrayal was not distant? What if it was not hidden in the shadows? What if the one who deceived the Empire was someone standing right beside the king? The truth did not arrive with chaos. It arrived in silence, sharp and precise, cutting through the foundation of Lucian Veyron's empire like a blade no one saw coming. Arya Bennett had followed the patterns, traced the movements, aligned every hidden inconsistency until all roads led to a single point. And when that point revealed itself, the weight of it was enough to shake even the strongest sense of control. The traitor was not distant. He was not hidden in the shadows. He stood at the very center of the Empire, Lucian's most trusted advisor, a man whose loyalty had never been questioned, whose presence had always been constant, whose voice had shaped decisions that defined the balance of power within the Empire. He had stood beside the king for years, close enough to understand every weakness, every strength, every silent rule that governed everything Lucian had built. And he had used that knowledge perfectly, not for chaos, but for control. The betrayal was not driven by impulse or desperation. It was calculated, patient, designed to dismantle the empire from within while maintaining the illusion of stability. Financial systems had been manipulated slowly, routes redirected subtly, influence shifted without drawing attention. Every move had one purpose: to weaken the foundation just enough to eventually take it over completely. And Arya had been the perfect cover, an unnoticed girl with access to patterns no one else cared about. When she came too close to the truth, she was turned into the scapegoat, her existence reshaped into a narrative of betrayal that would redirect all suspicion away from the real threat. It had been flawless, until she survived, until Lucian saw what no one else did. The moment the truth settled between them, the Empire changed. Not gradually, instantly, because betrayal at that level did not remain contained. It spread, loyalty fractured, control was tested, and war began. Not the kind fought in open streets or visible chaos, but a silent war that moved through corridors, through alliances, through every decision that could shift power from one side to the other. The tension was suffocating, the danger constant, the uncertainty growing with every passing moment. No one knew who could be trusted anymore, and that uncertainty was the most dangerous weapon of all. Lucian did not hesitate. The king did not fall back. He stepped forward, his control sharpened into something colder, something more absolute. Every move he made carried the weight of finality. There was no room for doubt, no tolerance for hesitation. The empire did not need comfort, it needed dominance. And Lucian delivered it without question. But the war was not without risk, because Arya became the center of it. The moment the truth surfaced, she became the most valuable and the most vulnerable piece in the entire structure. The one who had uncovered everything was now the one everyone needed to silence. The whispers grew louder, the tension around her tightening like a closing circle. She felt it, every breath heavier, every step watched, her heart pounding not with fear alone, but with awareness. She was no longer invisible. She was a target, and Lucian knew it. His protection intensified, no longer subtle, no longer distant. It became immediate, constant, unbreakable. The message was no longer hidden within silence. It was clear in every action, every shift in his presence. She was his, not as possession, but as priority. Mine. The instinct was undeniable now, stronger than strategy, deeper than control. No one reached her without going through him, and no one was willing to cross that line. But Arya did not remain behind him. She stepped forward, not recklessly, not blindly, but with the same quiet precision that had brought her this far. She took risks, not because she wanted to prove herself, but because she understood what was at stake. Her loyalty was no longer uncertain. It was chosen. She was not a victim, she became powerful. And that power showed, not in force, but in clarity, in the ability to see what others missed, in the strength to stand within the storm instead of running from it. Together, they moved through the war, piece by piece, dismantling the betrayal that had nearly destroyed everything. The advisor's influence began to collapse, his control unraveling as the truth exposed every hidden move he had made. The empire shook under the pressure, its stability tested in ways it had never been before. But it did not fall, because Lucian did not allow it, and Arya did not let him face it alone. The final shift came not with noise, but with certainty. The betrayal was exposed completely, its foundation removed, its influence erased from the structure it had tried to claim. The war ended the same way it began, in silence. But the cost remained. The empire had survived, stronger, sharper, more controlled than ever before. And at the center of it stood something new. Not just the king, but the one who had changed the outcome of everything. Arya Bennett, no longer the girl who had been dragged into the storm, no longer the one who had been accused, hunted, or silenced. She stood within the empire now, not beneath it, not behind it, but inside it. And as the silence settled, as the final echoes of betrayal faded into nothing, one question remained, heavier than everything that had come before. After surviving a war that nearly destroyed an empire, what role would Arya Bennett play in it now? The war ended without celebration. There were no loud victories, no visible triumph, no moment where the empire paused to acknowledge how close it had come to collapse. Instead, silence took over, a heavy, controlled silence that settled into every corner of Lucian Veyron's world as the rebuilding began. Systems were reinforced, alliances restructured, loyalty redefined with sharper precision than before. The empire did not fall, it evolved. And at the center of that evolution stood Arya Bennett. The girl who once trembled under the weight of fear no longer existed in the same form. The echoes of her past still lingered, but they no longer defined her. Her breath was steady now, her heart no longer pounding from helplessness, but from awareness. She had seen the inside of danger, had walked through betrayal, had stood in the quiet storm of war, and she had not broken. She had changed. The shift was undeniable to everyone who observed her, but most of all, it was undeniable to Lucian. She no longer moved like someone trying to survive. She moved with control, with intention, with an understanding of the space she occupied. The mansion no longer felt like a place she had been brought into. It felt like a place she understood. She stood beside him now. Not behind, not below, beside. The difference was subtle to an outsider, But within the empire, it was everything. Power was not given lightly, and it was never shared without reason. Yet the balance between them had shifted, shaped not by words, but by everything they had endured together. Arya was no longer an exception within the system. She was becoming part of its foundation, a queen in the making. Lucian did not announce it. He did not need to. His acknowledgement came through action, through the way decisions began to include her presence, through the silent authority that followed her without question. When she entered a room, the atmosphere adjusted. Conversations did not stop in suspicion anymore. They shifted in recognition. She was no longer a variable. She was a constant. The emotional distance that once defined their connection had changed as well. Protection had not disappeared, but it had evolved into something deeper, something more complex than control alone. It was no longer just about keeping her safe. It was about ensuring she stood where she belonged. Close. Always close. The space between them carried a different kind of tension now. Not built on uncertainty, not driven by fear, but shaped by something that had grown slowly, quietly, through shared silence and unspoken understanding. There were moments where words would have been unnecessary even if they had been allowed. Moments where breath aligned, where presence alone was enough. Loyalty, once uncertain, had become unbreakable, not forced, not demanded, but chosen. Arya had chosen to stand within the Empire, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she understood what it had become, and what she had become within it. The girl who once wanted to escape now held the power to shape what remained. She was not a victim, she became powerful. The truth of it echoed through everything she did, through the way she carried herself, through the clarity of her decisions, through the quiet strength that replaced the fear that once defined her. The Empire responded. It grew stronger, not just through regained control, but through transformation. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed it had forced it to rebuild with sharper awareness, deeper precision. And at the center of that new structure stood not just a king, but something the Empire had never fully recognized before. A queen. Arya became more than a survivor of the war. She became a symbol, not of weakness, not of rescue, but of strength that rose from being underestimated, from being pushed into danger and refusing to be consumed by it. The whisper of her story moved through the Empire, not as rumor, but as quiet understanding. She was proof that power did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it emerged from the places no one thought to look, and Lucian knew it, perhaps before anyone else. The king who controlled everything had not simply protected her. He had recognized her, and in doing so, he had altered the future of his empire. The final shift settled in silence, the same way everything between them had always begun. There was no need for declaration, no need for confirmation. The balance had already changed. Fear had turned into safe, safe had turned into power, and power had turned into something far greater. Queen. She was never just the girl who cried in the rain, never just the one dragged into a world she did not understand. That version of her had ended the moment she chose to stand, to see, to fight in her own way. She became the woman who ruled beside the king. And in a world built on betrayal, where control defined survival and loyalty was constantly tested, one truth remained sharper than any war that had come before. The most dangerous power in the empire was not the king who controlled it. It was the queen he chose to protect. She was never just the girl who needed protection. She became the one who could control an empire. But here's what most people don't realize. When a king chooses someone that powerful, is it trust or the beginning of another betrayal? Now tell me, would you stand beside her or fear her the most?